Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. I'll be reading today a story called The Architects of Cool from a series I'm calling Swamp Castle. Full disclosure, some of you, all five of you, have heard this story before several years ago in 2013, where I read several of my better short stories for the initial episodes of the podcast. However, because I had mic problems at the time, and because I'm going to be basically creating a YouTube video, which is an anthology of all my short stories and the older ones that I've written, I'm going to be rereading about 5 or 6 of them. So some of you have heard this before, others will not. Enjoy as you will. The Architect of Cool. The Architect of Cool tightened his slick black leather gloves as he gripped the throttle of his intergalactic hoverbike. He was here to make the Earth cool again. The architect would take no chances now. There was too much at stake. His melancholy gaze glanced over the alien marketplace. It was worth it, every second. The internal mechanisms of the bike were beyond him. Its technological magic came from 100 different worlds. The bike sung to his soul with the thrumming sound of pistons that made when they piped quantum fire through their workings. The thick sheen of his helmet glittered in the triple moonlight, and time waited. He knew, deep down, that this was only the illusionary hope projected by his own subconscious onto his perceived reality. But at long last, he had come to understand the importance of that perception. Illusion and reality were only so separated as the mind chose to make them. The roaring rage of the bike howled, mourning that its packmates did not howl in return. They could not. They were dead now, as were all of the architect's brethren. He was the last, and when he was done, there would be no others. The understanding would go with him, for 1,000 years at least. He cared not. Understanding was a small price to pay. The bike lunged forward, scattering carts and bins and fruit-packed ceramic pyramids. A small light blinked on Harris Harg's console. He put down his hot slosh and paid attention to the screen, his ceremonial tick hat clattering off his seat. He sent a thought arm down to the ground and picked it up again. Such a nuisance, but the thing was a badge of office, and he had no choice but to wear it. While the arm worked, he focused his primary attentions to the numbers spouting on the screen. It could not be, yet there it was. The K-tip had very little capacity for self-denial. Nature had cruelly bereft their race of any possibility of ignoring what was. That was a good thing in a warden, particularly when trouble was brewing. Harisharg leapt to his feet and went to the door. A second later, he walked through the move portal and found himself halfway across the planet and in chaos. This assignment was supposed to be peaceful. The locals caused little trouble. At most, he was called to resolve heavy traffic or undue strangers paying attention to the extremely private O'Malley, but this, he grabbed his dick stick and pointed it at the offender. Harisharg unleashed a blob of molten, intelligent metal at speeds most sentients could not comprehend. He missed. Harisharg never missed. Something was definitely wrong. Faster and faster, the architect moved through the twisted mazes of 1,000 different stalls of merchandise. He increased his speed yet again. More people fled before him. More dived, more screamed, more fled. None were hurt. The architect had been far too careful for that. That would undo all that he'd worked for. He saw the hostile construct fly by him as he dodged out of the way. He laughed joyfully at the attempt. He could only imagine the confusion of the man who wasn't a man's part. They weren't supposed to miss. Again, he silently thanked those who had passed. It was their genius that had made this day possible. He turned the bike around with a screeching turn, the plasma burning the air, making its twist up around him like a desert mirage. He stood still, hovering only a fraction of a hand above the ground. He flicked a switch, and the music began to play. The aliens below stood rapt, awestruck. It was blatantly disrespectful to the domestic bliss, yet they could not help but pay attention to its subtle melodies. What was it? What could it be? The architect merely laughed a second time, though none could hear him through his helmet. Herishag ran the intruder through the base and found that his quarry was a human. He'd never heard of them, though he ignored the filtered details that displayed on the back of his link mind. For the moment, he was far more concerned with the elimination of the problem. 3 times he shot with his dick stick, and 3 times the shots went wild. What was happening? No matter. There was more than one way to solve this kind of thing. The alien warden rose to its full height, 5 times larger than the largest man the architect had ever seen. He wanted to run, but stood his ground. The parameters told him precisely what to do, and running was not the ideal solution. Boldly, the architect dismounted his bike, black boots touching the alien dirt. With a short, defiant kick, he spread the tiny dust cloud in the air. The onlookers backed away, scattering at this opulent display of disgust and defiance. Every eye and every sensory organ focused on him as the architect boldly strode towards the warden. The warden, rising still higher above the crowd, floated in the air and began to pulse and throb with the red light. Its jeweled skin sharpened into a bladed rose garden of deadly anger. Slowly, it began to whirl and scream with the ancestral rage bequeathed to it by nature. Now the onlookers fled. The architect did not flee. The warden bellowed a challenging, defiant roar at the affront, sending 3 and then 4 tendrils to subdue the architect. The architect dodged to the left, the right again, and then the left, jumping up, ducking down, bending back, leaning forward, all moving him out of the way of the warden, grasping nothing but air. Soon the warden glowed an even deeper red, enraged by excess heat. Its body forced itself to cool down. Catip were not designed for such a long-term heavy labor. They were favored for their thoroughness, excellent senses, and racial intolerance for darkness. This planet had more advanced methods of dealing with troublemakers, but the warden was almost always sufficient. Harshag was upset. Any member of the 12,000 civilized worlds would agree with him. This was a blatant lack of respect that he simply could not tolerate. Deep down, he could not deny a certain fear about it all. This world had been chosen for him because of his superior administrative skills, not because of his physical prowess. What was he to do? He was the only warden. There was no backup that could arrive in time. He had a solution, of course. He was not defenseless, nor was any of these worlds that were protected. The known penalty for violation was too severe if called for, but many would view his rightful response at this point as excessive. Sadly, Herishag had to agree. It was simply too much, too violent. Herishag didn't want to do something more extreme, but he couldn't allow this kind of behavior to continue either. He quickly sent a thought arm through the inventories and customs forms, filled out by the merchants in the marketplace. There it was. It was true, you really could buy anything here. He quickly authorized the small dent in the emergency funds. The buzzing of the war droids caught the architect by surprise. The plan hadn't entailed this, but fortunately, of the entire original band that had sent him from Earth on the quest, he had had the greatest combat experience. He pulled out the quantum shotgun from his boot holster and pointed it at the imploding cloud of nanite death. Then he thought better of it. The architect leapt onto his bike and sped away as fast as it would carry him. For the briefest of moments he had a sliver of self-doubt, but pushed that down as fast as it appeared. He had to have faith. It was about faith and instinct, not logical introspection. You just did. You just felt. His fears proved groundless, however, for the war droids were just as fast as his bike, faster even. They were gaining ground. Good, the architect thought to himself. If this works, it will help make things even better. If it doesn't, then who cares? There wouldn't be anyone around to give the plan a second try anyway. His first run into the merchant stalls had been designed for disruption, but his second was designed for evasion. Superhuman reflexes challenged coordinating meme minds that tried to find the optimal path, only to be confused by the barrage of civilian signs and comm nets that bombarded anyone walking down the promenade. The confusion only stopped them for a moment, however, as they moved towards the architect yet again. But a moment was all that he needed as he dropped the sprawling video screen crashing down electric death on their short-lived virtual lives. Exit the warbots. Herishag did not believe it. The warbots would normally have neutralized entire legions of troops. They were among the toughest weapons allowed in guild-sanctioned wars. Not only had the human destroyed them, but it appeared that he had been able to do so with minimal effort. He was alone out here. The Omali would be of no help whatsoever. He had tried to be reasonable. He had tried to do the right thing. Hereshag knew beyond any doubt that he had taken every scalable option left to him before the final one, but the law was the law. Order would be maintained. The architect smiled when he looked up and saw the bright flash across the night sky. He knew what was coming. It was why he had come here in the first place. The faint pulling he felt in his lungs was the beginning of the end. It did not matter. He had fulfilled his destiny. He had changed destiny. Effortlessly, he leapt on the bike and rocketed for the stars. The source of his death was inevitable, but not irrelevant. Determined to eke out one final ounce of the nectar of glory that he had harvested for humanity, he opened fire. The white-hot suns that emerged from the unholy quantum reaction would have destroyed the market as far as the eye could see if he had used them on the planet below. And they were just glorified fireworks, bouncing off the event horizon of the Glim. But glorified or no, they lit up the night sky from half a world away, their violent trails streaming forever across the O'Malley culture. They were thrilled, and yet they were terrified. This was something they did not understand, but the architect did. His breath began to fail as he streamed up out of the atmosphere. The huge, glowing sentinel stood over the planet, indisputable, undeniable, undefeatable. It disbanded his corporal atoms in seconds. The bike itself exploded in a final shower of shooting stars before it too was erased from creation. The Glim had done its job. Hereshag watched the Glim do its work with sadness and frustration. It made no sense. Why had the human done this thing? Why had it thrown its life away? Could it somehow have been ignorant of the Glim's power? Hereshag didn't think so. He trusted his gut. Ketip had excellent instincts for tracking things down that didn't fit or make sense. This was one of the things that made him exceptional as a warden. They did not let things like this, small things, escape them. The particularly annoying problem in this case was that Hereshag had no one to ask questions piling up in his mind. A lesser being would let it pass. Hereshag, the Katip, was not a lesser being. He twined all his thought arms together in frustration. He did not know where to start his inquest, and he would not let it go. The human had arrived on its own craft. The craft had vanished, just like its owner. No witnesses, no evidence, no motive, no sense. Hereshag decided that he would have to track the human's course. Patiently, he sent his thought arms out across the ether between the stars. Warden spoke to Warden, and the inquest spread. The questions Hereshag asked intrigued his fellows, for anomalous and impossible cases were something they desired. Then a small blue-white glow appeared before his eyes, containing the repository of all the Warden's detailed files on the species and their activities in the quadrant. It spread out before his eyes, breaking like pollen seeds as his brain digested it into usably smaller chunks. His prime mind would filter it later. On the surface, there was nothing very special about humans. They had emerged from obscurity about 700 years ago. According to the records, they had been quite interesting at the time. The galaxy at large had been fascinated by their culture, a few esoteric aspects of their technology that had never been seen before in their local food products. Humanity had obtained an astonishing amount of wealth in a relatively short period of time. Being a warlike species, they'd expanded quickly and then bombed themselves to a very low level of technology 3 centuries later. They were still recovering, and very few of their numbers had traveled the mainstream interstellar lanes. They appeared to be a short-lived species that burned brightly and then snuffed themselves out. While humanity might have been far more successful than most species that followed that model, they were not really that atypical. However, in the last 2 centuries, the small, tight-knit community of humans that was not on their backward barbarian world had been amongst the best-behaved and most honorable people imaginable, timid even. And that was the problem. The K-Tape looked down from his spaceship at this scarred little blue and green-white planet. He wanted to see it to gain a proper appreciation. Various probes showed the now primitive Earth inhabitants engaged in daily activity, warring, procreating, existing, and politicking. On the surface, there was nothing unusual. Hereshag noticed a single tick off his checklist, or Hereshag notched a single tick off his checklist. He could not prove that the human had been from Earth, but his intuition told him otherwise. The human's behavior had reflected a curious mix of aggressiveness and restraint which confounded simpler analysis. The galactic overlords had been surprised when Hereshog had asked for time off to pursue the problem. He had never asked for time off before. K-Tip did not require recreational activity, but they did sometimes require deeper understanding than their standard duties provided time to pursue. He kept checking the scanner while he looked down at the junkyard moon below. Hereshog glacked with satisfaction as his sensors found one of the human's old outposts. He swung the ship around, directing it to hover several hundred meters above the graveyard. The ship's computer linked with that of the outpost and began to examine the historical records. He learned a great many things, but nothing he felt answered the questions of the strange human's behavior. Had it simply been some kind of prank? Hereshog didn't think so. The preparation had obviously been too meticulous. The action itself was plain and simple enough to understand. It was the why that plagued him. Days turned into weeks. Then, after rummaging through the dustbin of human history, Hereshog found the answer he was looking for. The lizard-like hologram before him was half his body height, but twice as long. It had 3 eyes and a long, sinuous neck. Hereshog recognized it instantly, and at first he thought that somehow the human had been involved in one of their schemes. The Dweezil were not the first aliens to contact humanity, but for a short time they had pretended to be humanity's friend. The Dweezil were one of only 9 species that any warden was allowed to shoot on sight without asking any questions or having any just cause for suspicion. Being a Dweezil was a sufficient reason for suspicion. They were a step above simple con artists and tricksters. Quite frankly, the galaxy had more than enough species that fit that quality. No, the Dweezil took the concept to a whole new level. Dweezil were master social manipulators. They instinctively understood how a culture functioned and considered it amusing to change it to their whim. It was quite obvious from the records that the Dweezil had been jealous. Humanity had attracted attention in a way that no other race had attracted in 10 or 20 years, except the Dweezil, who happened to emerge onto the galactic scene at the same time. It had been a simple process of cultural subversion. It had started out simple enough. The Dweezil started acting human, and then they inserted themselves into as the best friend humanity never had. Then they started mocking the very things that humans prided most about themselves. By the time they were done, humans as a race had no faith in themselves whatsoever. The Warden looked down at the little blue planet below with sympathy. It all made sense now. The human had been trying to restore his racial pride. It was an extremely subtle strategy. Most of the other races in the galaxy could care less that the human had died, but humans seemed to have a morbid fascination with death. Before their culture had been contaminated, noble self-sacrifice had been one of their highest ideals. This they shared in common with many others. To a human, the ultimate expression for an ideal was a willingness to give up their life for it. He did not know much about the human, but Hereshog respected it. When the humans below eventually reached the stars the second time, they would have something to idealize besides the tame humans timidly relying on other races' breadcrumbs. The human had deliberately created a vague figure who was both rebellious, tough, and yet not pointlessly violent that they could look up to. Most would think that the human had died simply pointlessly. Hereshog knew better, particularly now that he'd studied the way humans thought. The report would lay buried for centuries, potentially millennia, but sooner or later it would come out again. Hereshog intended to write it up to help the dead human accomplish his goal. The humans deserved that much at least. After decrying the villainous way the human had disrupted market efficiency while flaunting authority would go a long way to making it seem authentic. With a fine touch of awe at the human's audacity at assaulting the Glim, Hereshog could nudge their plot along nicely. Satisfied, he turned his ship back around, slingshotting it around the tiny sun and towards deep space. So, I like this story. This is, I think, a transition between the early stories I had, which were really good ideas, that were, I'll be honest, for the most part unreadable, and some of the later stories I have that could actually theoretically have been taken up by a magazine, but never quite got that good. And plus my writing skill just wasn't that good at the time. But if I was to write this again, I think the first thing I would do is I would create a flash forward, flashback series with the Dweezil and have the Dweezil actually show the Dweezil subverting humanity's culture slowly, one bit at a time. and then have the last third of this story where Hurashog investigates what happened basically just be like the very last part for anybody that was too dim to figure out what was going on. It's a great idea. At the time when I wrote this, I was first starting to get involved with the folks at Mythic Journeys, which is all about understanding and using myth to help shape culture and help bring meaning in a situation where, quite frankly, we've lost it in a lot of cases. But I think in general, the story is enjoyable, but it has problems. I think I should have humanized the architect a bit more. I deliberately kept him vague, primarily because that was his mission. And that is okay in a story, but there are ways to subtly hint at who a person is without even necessarily, I think the best example I can think of is V and V for Vendetta, where you never learn his actual name. You never actually, in the movie, see his face. He's deliberately kept as this vague figure that will inspire future generations. But, you still learn a lot about V in that movie and in the comic. I could have done more to give the architect a definition. I could have also done a little bit more about Hurashog himself. Just little details. I think this story, if I was to rewrite it, unlike some of the others I've done in this series, is salvageable, but probably not enough compared to just writing another story from scratch.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!